Thank you for an outstanding presentation, Dr. Ball. We will have both Dr. Ball and our next speaker answering questions after the next presentation. That way they'll each have a fair chance and time won't be a constraint. Our next speaker is someone who I truly do not feel worthy of introducing. There is an upper echelon of truly great scientists in the world, and there's also an upper echelon of truly kind, giving people in the world. And our next speaker fits both. Regarding the science, he is a distinguished research professor at George Mason University and professor emeritus of environmental science at the University of Virginia. He is a founder and president of the Science and Environmental Policy Project. His previous government and academic positions include chief scientist, U.S. Department of Transportation, deputy assistant administrator of policy, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Water Quality and Research, U.S. Department of the Interior, Founding Dean of the School of Environmental and Planetary Sciences, University of Miami, First Director of the National Weather Satellite Service, and Director of the Center for Atmospheric and Space Physics, University of Maryland. He has been a scientific pioneer in more ways than I can count, and even now here at this conference, our next speaker will unveil still more pioneering direction. He has recently co-authored the book Unstoppable Global Warming Every 1,500 Years. That is one of the most informative and, if you believe the New York Times bestseller list, one of the most popular climate science books that has been written. Regarding the person, he has for 7 years graciously provided me with his knowledge and advice as I have tried to tell the truth in environment and climate news. No question is too trivial for him to answer, no request too burdensome for him to fill. Even at this conference, as he has media seeking virtually every minute of his time, he has insisted that for any assistance I need, all I have to do is say the word. Rare does one encounter a person so selfless and so giving of his time, even when such past and present accomplishments would tempt most people to be self-centered rather than selfless. Ladies and gentlemen, my friend, Dr. Fred Singer.
Thank you for this introduction. I want to bring you some good news about the climate and some bad news. First, the good news. I believe the science is settled. I want to disavow here that I am Al Gore in disguise. I'm not Al Gore. The science is settled in the sense that we have evidence that most of the climate change that's taking place today is caused by natural forces and not by human activity. That is the main message I have. I will try to show you the evidence. I will hope to convince you that this is so. I believe the Ipcc is exactly wrong on this point when they conclude that most of the warming is caused by human activity. If we're correct, the consequences are far-reaching, particularly for policy. First of all, if climate change is primarily caused by natural forces, this means it's unstoppable. This means that carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. It means that there's absolutely no point in trying to control the emission of greenhouse gases. This would be a drastic change in the public view, particularly in the view of politicians. What's the bad news? The bad news is that we're a little late in getting there. The train is moving in the opposite direction. All you have to do is listen to our three presidential candidates, one of whom I'm sure is going to occupy the White House. But next January. The problem is that the science is in danger of becoming irrelevant, and that the whole climate business is being driven by money. I don't begrudge my scientific colleagues the $2 billion a year that the federal government spends on climate research. Much of it is well spent, and lots of scientific papers are coming forth. The government spends $5 billion a year on general climate research, including mitigation. Congress is now considering a $17 billion subsidy and tax scheme to benefit climate entrepreneurs who are in the wind and solar business and God knows what else. As a result of all of this, many have discovered that one can make money on climate change. Al Gore may have preceded them in discovering this, but they're following him rapidly. And that brings the danger that this could be irreversible, at least for a while, and cause great economic damage. That is the bad news. The result from this is, of course, that climate activists have been pushing the buttons, that the media have been listening to them, and that politicians think that the media represents the public. That is not true. The public, by and large, doesn't consider climate change a big deal. They have other priorities, and I hope that will make an impression on politicians. So now that I've announced what I'm going to tell you, I could sit down, but I don't think I'll do that. I want to show you the evidence, and I hope that you will agree with me that this is convincing, and that it can be used to convince others. This evidence has been assembled in a report which is in your tote bag called Nature, Not Human Activity Rules the Climate. It's a report of the non-governmental International Panel on Climate Change, which is consciously modeled after the IPCC. We use the same information, plus information that they have ignored, plus information that came to light and was published in peer-reviewed journals after the IPCC deadline of May 2006. And we reached the opposite conclusion. NIPCC can be pronounced in many ways. I keep calling it NIPIC, but you can call it anything you wish. So here is the summary for policymakers of the NIPIC report. We follow in the time-honored IPCC tradition of publishing the summary before we publish the report. However, we promise you we will not alter the report to conform to the summary. So, this is the basic issue. The cause of global warming. Is it human-caused or natural? This issue is so basic that once you settle it, everything else is commentary. Glaciers melting, sea ice melting, polar bears, whatever, everything else is commentary. Because this will tell you whether you can do something or not. If it is human-caused, and CO2 is a greenhouse gas and increasing, that's plausible. So that's a possibility that you have to investigate carefully. I would maintain that the IPCC has brought forth no firm evidence to support that the cause of the current warming is human. If it is natural, that's also plausible, because we know the climate has always been warming or cooling. So how can you tell How can you tell what the cause is? You look at thermometers. Temperatures are increasing. You can ask them. They won't talk. They won't tell you. You have to use sophisticated methods. The method we use is the method that is also approved by the Ipcc. We all agree on the methodology. We disagree on the results. The methodology is to compare the patterns of warming, the calculated pattern, calculated from climate models, with the pattern that's actually observed, and see if the patterns agree. These patterns are called fingerprints. To see if the fingerprints match, that's the issue. I'll give you the answer right now. They don't match. So our conclusion is that the human contribution is not significant, that climate change is mostly natural and therefore unstoppable, and we derive all this by comparing greenhouse models, published in the IPCC report, with the patterns observed by weather balloons, also published in the IPCC report. We don't add any new data to this, or we don't need to. It's all there. All you need to do is to connect the dots and draw the right conclusion. And anyone can do that. You're looking here at the pattern of warming derived from climate models. Every climate model has roughly the same pattern. This is the fingerprint of greenhouse warming. I'll explain it. In the middle, you see the equator. To the left, you see the North Pole. To the right, the South Pole. So this is latitude on the horizontal axis and height on the vertical axis. And what is characteristic of greenhouse warming is that the rate of warming, the warming trend, increases with altitude in the tropical zone and is roughly 2 times greater, or even more than 2 times greater, than it is at the surface. This big red blob that you see, centered at roughly 10 kilometers, 6 miles up, in the tropical zone from 30 north to 30 south, that is the characteristic fingerprint of greenhouse warming. Everyone agrees on that. That's in the IPCC report. We agree. Now let me show you the actual observations. No blob. No increase in warming with altitude. In fact, if you see that little blue area over the equator in the middle, that's a slight decrease in the warming trend. In other words, the fingerprint of the observations from weather balloons taken all over the world gives a result which is exactly opposite to that of the greenhouse models. The fingerprints do not agree. They do not match. This means that we can exclude a significant contribution from greenhouse warming, and therefore we must conclude that the warming is mostly natural. Now, you can present the same data, the same comparison between models and observations in a different way. This is a publication in a journal of the Royal Meteorological Society, published last December, just a few months ago. If you listened this morning, you probably heard the paper presented by David Douglas, the lead author in this work. And it shows how the climate trend, the warming trend on the left, in the vertical axis, increases with altitude in the models and decreases in the observations. That's really all you need to know. The disagreement is striking. Now you might ask, what do our opponents say to this? After all, we did battle with referees to get this thing published. Well, the only good answer they've gotten is, well, maybe there's something wrong with the data. Mind you, they don't say there's something wrong with the models. I think it illustrates a fundamental split in the atmospheric science community between those who believe in models and those of us who believe in the atmosphere. That's the basic split. We believe in the atmosphere, in data, empirical evidence. Models, very nice, but they're not reality, and they're not evidence. What is interesting, that all we did was to connect the dots. In essence, the same information was available to the Ipcc from published work, including a US government report, an important US government report, the so-called CCSP, Climate Change Science Program, published in 2006. But they ignored that information. They ignored the facts. Why? Because if they had pursued the matter as we did, they would have found that they did not uphold their conclusion that global warming is anthropogenic. So they just ignored it. That is the problem. Now, we have two further questions. If the warming is not anthropogenic, if it's natural, we have to ask, why do climate models overestimate the warming effects of greenhouse gases? The answer is that the models ignore negative feedbacks from clouds and also from water vapor, which would decrease the warming effects of carbon dioxide. In other words, we don't deny that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. We don't deny that carbon dioxide is increasing. But the models do not handle negative feedbacks properly. And you'll hear more about this tomorrow from Roy Spencer in his talk at the lunch. And the second question to ask is, well, what are the principal causes of climate variations on decadal timescale? Timescale that matters to us. We're not interested in millennial, million years or anything like that right now. It's very likely, and the most probable explanation is that it's solar activity, and specifically variations in the solar wind and solar magnetic activity that affect cosmic rays coming to the Earth, and these in turn affect cloudiness. That is a mode of thinking that's now gaining acceptance. We're not 100% sure yet, but it's likely to be the correct answer. I'll show you some evidence that supports this. The evidence comes from historic data, paleoclimatology, in stalagmites from caves. And the first one of these studied, published in Nature a few years ago, comes from a cave in Oman on the Arabian Peninsula. And these records in stalagmites show a remarkable correlation between the isotope of carbon, carbon-14, and the isotope of oxygen, oxygen-18, over a period of 3,000 years. A very close correlation. Now, carbon-14, as we know, is generated by cosmic rays in the upper atmosphere, and cosmic rays are modulated by solar activity. So in essence, carbon-14 is a proxy for solar activity. And oxygen-18 is a recognized proxy for temperature, used widely by paleoclimatologists. And here's the data. The upper graph shows carbon-14 and oxygen-18, oxygen-18 measured in the stalagmite, and you can actually count the layers in the stalagmite, so you know exactly where you are. It's like tree rings. You can count the years. There's no question about the date. And look at the exact correspondence between the carbon-14 and the oxygen-18. The second graph below is a central section blown up. It's a 400-year period, and you can see in detail how the oxygen-18 and carbon-14 variations match each other. This work was published by a group in Germany, in Nature, in 2001, and to me is very convincing. It indicates that this solar variability is the real cause of climate change, or principal cause of climate change, on a decadal time scale. Well, I'd like to talk about one other topic, sea level. Why sea level? Well, because it's uppermost in the public mind. People are not really worried about temperature. Most people really don't love ice polar bears. They're really grizzly bears, as you know, that turned white when they moved to the Arctic some many millennia ago. And meeting up with a grizzly bears aren't exactly friendly animals. Well, they're not cuddly. And besides, you know, I hate to tell you this, but polar bears like to eat little cuddly seal pups. And you remember that a long time ago, before Greenpeace discovered that global warming was a moneymaker, they were out there protecting seal pups in Canada. Well, polar bears are voracious feeders of little seal pups. Love them, delicious. Look at the predictions of the sea level rise. The predictions of the IPCC, as I will show you, in their 4 reports, have decreased dramatically. Dramatically. Why? Well, they've learned something about the subject, and they still don't quite understand it. Hansen, and of course Al Gore, listening to him, predict values that are roughly, I'd say, 30 times the value of the IPCC. I've worked in this field and published in it. Our best value is 18 centimeters per century, 18 centimeters per century, which is the value of sea level rise that has existed for the last millennia, irrespective of temperature fluctuations. We don't see any acceleration of sea level rise in the 20th century in spite of the warming before 1940 and the cooling after 1940. Sea level keeps marching on more or less steadily at the same rate. But since sea level is rising naturally at 18 centimeters per century, saying that it will be 18 centimeters higher in 2100 means it won't increase because of global warming or anything else. There's nothing we can do about this. Sea level is rising because it has risen for millennia. I'll show you the data. Well, in a minute. First, the results of the IPCC. You see here the 4 reports, 1990, 1995, 2001, and 2007. There was a little bit of a glitch. They had a draft which gave lower values, then in the final report, they raised the values. They don't explain why, but they raised them slightly. Anyway, you see the dramatic decrease in the maximum value of sea level rise. Way over on the right, on top, you see a little dot that's marked H. That's Jim Hansen. He's an outlier. He's a contrarian. Clearly disagrees with the IPCC. At the bottom there, under Hansen, there's a red S. That's me. But actually, the incremental sea level rise to 2100 will be, as I explained, will be 0. No change. Now, what does it all lead to? From a policy point of view, this means that carbon dioxide mitigation is not needed, is useless, can't have any effect on climate. It means that the schemes being developed in the Congress for cap and trade, the schemes being developed in the European Union for cap and trade are pointless, simply political, and very, very expensive. Ethanol, ineffective and wasteful, heavily subsidized. It's a moneymaker for people who get tax credits and subsidies. And it's being paid for by all of us through the increased cost of gasoline. In fact, it's worse than that. We're paying twice over. We're paying as taxpayers for the subsidies, and we're paying as consumers when we buy gasoline. Wind and solar, marginally useful, many subsidies, not likely to do very much good. Carbon capture, probably one of the worst ideas. Carbon capture, that is, capturing the carbon emitted from power plants, consumes roughly half the output of the power plant. It means you have to build 2 power plants to get the same amount of electricity. That's basically my presentation, but I want to say a few more words. I want to say a few words about this report. This report is the summary for policymakers. It was a shapeless mess when we turned it over to the Heartland Institute, and I want to acknowledge the contribution of Joe Bast and of Diane Bast in editing this document and bringing it to the state in which it is now. My original draft had a little section which said acknowledgements. It was omitted, and I would like to see that it comes back in again when we reprint it. Also, I want to thank our contributors, about 24 of them, and I would ask them if they would please, they're listed on one of the front pages, would they please stand up so we can see them? Bob, stand up.